Our next speaker is Dr. Randy Jackson from the University of Wisconsin. And he is a professor of Grassland Ecology in the Department of Agronomy, chair of the Agroecology Master's Program, co-lead of sustainability research for the Department of Energy Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center, and a PI in the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems trial, which I think is going to be the focus of his talk today. I want to note that he was hired, and I love this phrase, as part of a 3-person agroecology cluster hiring at UW in 2003. Just love that phrase. Randy.
I like to think that the agroecology cluster hire was part of the infernal vortex that Emily laid out for us. I haven't gotten spit out the other end yet, unfortunately. Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Emily, for a nice presentation. So I want to talk today about another long-term cropping systems trial that's been going on in Wisconsin for 26 years. Well, another one that's been another long-term trial, not another one in Wisconsin, similar to the one in California. This was started by my late, oh, this is not hooked up, is it? By my friend and late colleague, Josh Posner, in 1989, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago. And so really all the work that I'm going to represent today is his work, along with 2 of his students, Janet Hedke and Greg Sanford, who now continues to work in my lab group as a research scientist. And so I just want to make sure that it's clear that this is their work and I'm here to report it. Similarly, I'm merely a grassland ecologist and not an agronomist, although I like to say I'm embedded in the Department of Agronomy at UW-Madison. And so I'll defer all agronomic questions to Emily and deal with the grassland ecology questions today. I want to point out that the work that I'm going to talk about has been primarily funded by the Center for Integrated Agricultural Systems at UW-Madison and the College of Agricultural Life Sciences, as well as support from many other institutions along the way over the 26 years. So WICST, as we refer to it, is positioned here at the Arlington Agricultural Research Station in south central Wisconsin. There were originally 2 locations, and I'll talk about data from both of them today. One of them was decommissioned in 2002 for funding reasons, and it was located down here in southeastern Wisconsin. Both of them on very, very productive, very, very rich mollisols that were prairie-derived soils, and they're some of the most productive, beautiful soils in the world. They're large plots that lend themselves to field-scale equipment in terms of planting, harvesting, and treatment and that sort of thing. And Josh started this, like so many other sustainability projects, around the idea of understanding the productivity, profitability, and environmental responses of these to these different types of systems. So here is the clever diagram that Josh developed for WICST, and you can see here that they're arrayed along gradients of complexity and perenniality on the north-south axis there. The top 3 are grain production systems, the middle 3 are forage production systems, the typical Midwestern forage production systems, and then finally some native grass systems that I really won't talk about today directly, although as a grassland ecologist I'd be happy to go on and on and on about them. These are all rain-fed systems in the heartland. So I'm not going to get too bogged down here, but we have continuous corn for 26 years, a corn-soybean rotation, and then an organically managed but not certified treatment of corn-soybean with a wheat winter crop that goes into clover. On the forage side, we have corn followed by 3 years of alfalfa, corn followed by oats and as a nurse crop for organic alfalfa, followed by another year of organic alfalfa, and then finally our third forage treatment, which is a perennial cool season grass managed grazing system. So let me tell you a little bit about some of the productivity results from that were published by Josh and others in the Agronomy Journal. And this looks at data from a roughly 12-year period, 1990 to 2002. And the takeaway message, this was alluded to earlier in the morning presentations, the takeaway message on the grain systems, just looking at corn yields, our conventional no-till corn soybean yields compared to our organic corn soy wheat yields, is that in normal springs, organic yields of corn were some 95% of conventionally managed corn. It was the wet springs primarily where weed management was a tremendous problem. The soils are too mucky to get equipment out there to rotary hoe or even drag the tine to break up the weeds in the early spring before the canopy can get up. These are the years that the organic systems really suffered, roughly 75% of corn yield in those years. The story was identical for soybean yields. About 75% of yields for in wet springs, and in normal, so-called normal years, some 95% of yield, at least at Arlington and also at our southern site. So just sort of reiterates what we heard about earlier today, that productivity, at least of these two major commodity crops and rain-fed systems, can be very similar between organic and conventional, although there are ongoing issues with managing weeds that need to be addressed. Looking at profitability then, Jean-Paul Chavas, who's an agricultural economist, looked at those data over a similar period and calculated the gross margins that you might realize from these different systems. So here's a conventional no-till corn soybean rotation compared to the organic grain rotation. So I should have said earlier, before I go on, one of the things that Josh wrestled with for a couple of decades, one of the things that he frankly was often crucified for, was the systems research that he was conducting. There are many confounded factors in these different comparisons of different systems. And yet that is the crux of systems research, isn't it? I mean, if we want to start to break down those systems and understand every little mechanism, that's a different type of research. And so that's the good fight that Josh fought over the years, was trying to maintain the complexity in those systems in ways that they could be comparable, but to resist the urge to break apart the systems too much. So anyway, with that little editorial note aside, at Arlington and at the Lakeland complex, in both situations, you can see that the gross margins, which is the total income minus the variable costs, for the organic grain systems far outstripped the conventional systems. And that's largely due to the organic premium that's realized by the organic grain. The base gross margins, the blue bars, are reasonably similar. You can see built into those the differences in overall productivity, and then the government payment is reasonably similar across those systems as well. Again, the story was the same between the grain systems and the forage systems. The organic systems, because of the premium, higher gross margins. And so these are the same data, but looked at across all 6 of our systems. And what jumps out at you is that, what he did here was break it down into what the returns would be without government payments, what the returns would be with government payments for the grain, and then what they would be with government payments and the organic premiums. And as you can see here, the winner was the organic corn soybean rotation, although what also jumps out at you is that the organic forage was quite high relative to the conventional forage. And then, as somebody who likes perennial grasslands, there's no government payment for the perennial grasslands and no organic premium in this experiment for the grasslands, and so that was the most stable and across the board highest response. Interesting to note, though, that one could do managed rotational grazing, and many do in Wisconsin, with organic an organic system, and so one could realize an even higher return if they're doing organic managed grazing in this part of the world. And then the environment, I'll pull out 2 key papers that have come out of this research, one by Greg Sanford that was published a couple of years ago, in Ag Ecosystems and Environment, looking at the carbon balance of these systems, and then John Baldock published more work in the Agronomy Journal. So Greg's work was to take 20 years of soil carbon data from WICST and analyze how much carbon was there in 1990 and how much carbon was there in 2010. So it was a 20-year, did I get that right? 1990 to 2010, yeah. So it was a 20-year comparison. And depressingly, across all of the systems, there was a significant loss in carbon during that 20-year period, except for the managed grazing system, which again is perennial grass. Now, I said I was going to talk about the native grass systems, but there's where you see some actual accrual of carbon in the soils with the perennial grasses. Although, surprisingly, it wasn't particularly high. It was just barely significantly different than zero. So, all 5 of the annual cropping systems, I'll include alfalfa as part of an annual cropping system because the soil is disturbed on a periodic basis. We're losing carbon over this period. Now, these soils are, as I mentioned, some of the richest, most productive soils, mollisols in the world. They're quite high in organic carbon to begin with, and so one looks at these data and thinks, well, perhaps these soils are saturated with carbon and one can't do anything else to accumulate carbon in these soils. So that's one takeaway, that they might be at some equilibrium now as far as inputs and outputs of carbon go. Although if you put it in a perennial, into some sort of perennial grass, you can accumulate some carbon. How much longer that can go on, we don't know, and that's one of the key reasons to maintain a long-term cropping systems experiment here. That said, the soil organic carbon content of these soils, while it's quite high, is about 3.5% carbon. And we know from a remnant prairie that's just next door in the same soil type that the soil carbon there is about 10%. So if we ever want to try and approach that 10% level, this has got to be a really long-term experiment. And Chris Kucharik in our department has estimated that something on the order of 2,000 years would be adequate to build the carbon back up to 10%. That's a model projection, obviously. So yeah, we're not accumulating carbon here. The other part of this is that while it may be at an equilibrium, as we heard about earlier today, the climate is changing, and it's changing, generally speaking. It's getting warmer, which is unfortunate. But my colleague Chris Kucharik has also looked retrospectively at the climate change that has happened in Wisconsin over the last 50 years. And what we see is, I'm sorry I don't have the slide with me, but I'll wave my arms and paint the picture for you. In southeastern Wisconsin, it's gotten warmer and drier. And in southwestern Wisconsin, it's gotten cooler and wetter. And in northwestern, it's gotten warmer and wetter. And what I'm trying to say is that it's not just going to get warmer and drier everywhere, and not just going to get warmer and cooler everywhere. It's going to be highly variable, even within a state like Wisconsin, which, compared to this beautiful place that I grew up in here in California, is pretty homogeneous. So I think we have to be very careful about these projections and scaling up these data that we, when we look at, how are we likely to scrub carbon out of the atmosphere? Well, all we have to do is plant everything in organic, and that should help us scrub carbon out of the atmosphere. There are plenty of good reasons to plant organic crops. One of them may be to help take carbon out of the atmosphere, but the scaling up scenarios, I think, have been a little too simplified. Okay, that was only my second editorial of the talk. Fall soil nitrates. We're lowest in the organic corn, soybean, wheat rotation. And this is likely because we just had less nitrogen going into this system, whereas the forage systems, which are the two right-hand ones that had the most nitrate in the fall, were ones where we were putting a lot of manure onto the system to add nitrogen to the system. And so we saw higher nitrate levels in those systems than we did in the grain systems, which is typical of the way we manage forage systems in Wisconsin. And then finally, Janet Hedke did some modeling of soil loss, and here found that the most soil loss is happening from the organic systems. And this goes back to the weed management issues in spring. So when it is dry enough to get equipment on there to do mechanical management of weeds, there is significant soil loss from those systems relative to the conventionally managed systems. So, trade-offs that are inherent to these systems, lots of room for innovation, which I'm sure we'll hear more about for the rest of the week. It's not all wine and roses, but at least the productivity measures are quite similar. Just to summarize, the organic the organic and conventional systems were quite similar when weeds were well controlled. Profitability was much higher in the organic systems, although managed grazing was the most profitable. Man, if you can do organic managed grazing, you're really knocking it. All the annual systems were losing soil carbon, but weed management and fertility in the organic systems were resulting in higher nutrient and at least modeled soil losses. So I just want to end by paying homage to Josh Posner, who's pictured here. If you want to learn more about his darling, the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems Trial, you can visit our website. Thanks for listening. The question was, can I describe the managed grazing? Most of the years we borrowed heifers, dry heifers from the dairy, and rotated them through quite small paddocks that were dominated by timothy and orchard grass and white and red clover. And they got through those paddocks 3 or 4 times a season at a stocking rate of roughly 2 animal units per acre. 2 animal units per acre. It was a big adjustment for me moving from the West to the Midwest, where it's animal units per acre instead of acres per animal unit. Yeah, so the question is, have we done any work looking at why there's not wider adoption of, if I can paraphrase what you said, Charlie, more complex systems? Therein lies the answer, I think. I always tell my students in Grassland Ecology, when we say management intensive rotational grazing, there's a hyphen in there between management and intensive. It's intensively managed, not necessarily intensively grazed. And so that means a lot of work on the farmer's part to manage the system, to go out and check the pastures and move the water troughs, and you know all about that. So I think that part of it is just that it's just a more labor-intensive situation. The other part of it is that it's one thing to talk about net profitability, but another to talk about gross profitability. And there is just some merit in having a big operation. Maybe your net profitability is lower, but you're able to drive a huge pickup truck and go on vacation because you can hire people to work. Whereas a managed grazing system tends to be pretty constrained. I mean, there are some outliers, but pretty constrained. Family operations. You don't go on vacation necessarily. I can go on and on, but you get the picture.